I accept my mom for who she is, not for who I wish she had been for me.
What was that moment for you that said, I need to put this in a book? I need to put this experience and I need to be able to share it with the world?
That's true freedom. That's when all of us, all parts of ourselves has been accepted, then we're whole and we can walk in this world.
Guilt that gets put onto the kids of immigrants, and we call ourselves immigrants too, but the kids who are growing up in this new culture and trying to have to navigate all of this stuff, I just really think about that as, how do you hold space, or how do you start to learn to hold space for compassion for your parents and empathy for them?
How do we, as women, as girls, walk with our unbound feet? And not that we walk on eggshells, we walk in an empowered, we stand for ourselves, and we keep taking one step in front of the other in a beautifully empowered way.
Behind every opinion, every conflict, and every moment of courage, there is a human story longing to be understood. I'm Dr. Payal Beri, and this is Reframing Perspectives, a space for conversations that help us see ourselves and each other with more honesty and curiosity so that we can build empathy and compassion in our world. Here in these episodes, we're going to explore the layers of what it means to be human in leadership, in society, and in our everyday lives, and how by understanding those layers, it can reshape our relationships, our communities, and our impact. So let's step inside and let's begin. There are moments in all of our lives when we realize that the story we've been living isn't the one that we're meant to carry forward. Moments when we feel the quiet tug towards truth, towards shedding the expectations, identities, and narratives that were never ours to begin with. They were inherited. My guest today, Serena, is the author of an incredible book called Unbound, a book that explores what it means to break free from the roles that we've inherited culturally, emotionally, generationally, and step into a life shaped by self-honesty and personal liberation. This conversation is about the courage it takes to unlearn. It's about the tension between who we're raised to be and who we really are. And it's about how breaking free from ourselves can ripple into our relationships, our communities, and the collective stories that we pass down. Because becoming unbound isn't a solo act, it's a deeply human one. So let's go in. Serena, welcome to Reframing Perspectives. Your book, Unbound, gave me chills. I couldn't put it down. I read a lot of books, and there's a lot of books that are like, okay, I'm going to skim it. But yours was just the level of vulnerability that you write, the rawness that you put in here. It is truly, and there's so many pieces of this as an immigrant daughter myself, as someone who's a third culture kid, that I can truly relate to. And there's moments that are just, they're so eye-opening. So anyway, welcome to being here, because I can't wait to just dive into everything. Literally the level of rawness that you put in here, it's cathartic.
Thank you. Thank you for saying that. Thank you for having me. Thank you for embracing the book, and thank you for hearing it, letting it land the way it was intended to land. And so, thank you for seeing.
Yeah, of course. I mean, there's so many parts of this, and really, like, the story, you shared your life story in this. You share so many parts of what it means to be a mixed child of, you have an Indian father, you have a Chinese mother, and a mother who grew up also moving around under British colonization. You talk about, growing up in Canada. You talk about your experiences, your mom's cancer. I mean, the level of things that I'm actually going to read it out loud. These are the themes that I captured that you wrote about. Mixed race identity, immigrant daughterhood, cultural dissonance, inherited lineage, women's conditioning, intergenerational expectations, awakening, reconciliation with the self, healing across generations, channeling inherited resources, and returning home to yourself.
Yeah. The last 50 years of my life.
Yeah. So let's start with that. There's a lot of complex layers that you talk about in this book and what you share about your life, which what I loved about it is the fact that these are things that your experiences, of course, unique to you, but the experiences that you talk about are very centered to what it means to be a human. Mm-hmm. And all of us, to some degree, are battling or are in conflict with or are embracing those different layers that you touch on here. What was that moment for you that said, I need to put this in a book? I need to put this experience and I need to be able to share it with the world?
Thanks for asking that. It is a question that I often get. And it has been, I would say, writing the book was a journey in itself. And the whispers have been there for a long time. I didn't even know that this was what kind of book I was going to write. This book evolved as I was writing it. It started as a whisper, like, write your book. I didn't even know what I was writing about. I'm an Ayurvedic health practitioner. I'm a yoga therapist for over 25 years. For me, it was like, oh, do I write about yoga? And ultimately, the book is about yoga, but it's about the humanity of it, about being yoga, about how I had traveled the world to find something I'm looking for outside myself, whereas it's been with me the whole time, within me. And the book I knew had to have the journey described in it, that my detours that I took, the ups and downs, the roller coaster, the repetitive pattern that kept coming back over and over again in terms of how I saw myself and how I didn't see myself, where I had to keep, I really believe nothing happens by mistake. I believe in divine timing. I believe that we live and we have these experiences to show us the lesson. And if we don't listen or really learn it the first time, then it'll come back again. And for me, looking back on my life and remembering those pivotal moments was that it was the lesson that just kept coming back and over again. And I kept as I was writing, it was, what is the lesson? What was the lesson? And for me, in the last 7 years, I've really worked on my feminine embodiment, being a feminine, what it meant to be a woman and a feminine woman, and how much to be able to receive and then store enough of that resource that I can actually give it instead of feeling depleted and resentful, giving what I didn't have and didn't get. And it was never modeled for me. That kind of like really loving, nurturing, feminine energy was not nurtured or was not modeled for me. And so I had to learn to cultivate it myself. And that took all the experiences that I had to get me to this place. Now I live in Costa Rica and I'm not a mom. I never had children of my own. And so it really took, I believe, the universe guiding me all the way here over 50 years to say, here it is. This is the experience, and becoming like a stepmom overnight. And then realizing in my face, this little girl who represented and mirrored the little girl within me that didn't get what she needed, and how I kept hearing that voice, like, yes, the voice to write my book, but this voice was, what is she teaching you? What is she here to teach you? What is she here to teach you? And I was like, because normally I would just get out. I'm like, when in doubt, get out. And this one was, wow, I wanted so much to get out and leave, but I knew that this was it. This was the final lesson in it, but well, maybe not the final lesson, but it was the lesson that I needed to really learn and see and look at and then break that pattern.
Wow. There's layers in the book that you talk about, like as you're mentioning that it wasn't role modeled for you. And, I find this really fascinating, and I'm just so curious what your thoughts on it. Growing up Asian, two blends of Asian, but growing up Asian, right? There's this relationship about Asian cultures are so familial. Asian cultures care about hospitality. Asian cultures are warm. Asian cultures are very about family values, right?
Right.
And there's also that layer, as you're talking about, that yoga, Ayurveda, all of that came from Asia. It came from, India and South Asian subcontinent, all the things. And you look at them from the outside and it's like, oh, wow, that's so beautiful. That's so like, there's got to be such a awakening in individuals in that. But there's this dichotomy, right, that exists in the actual reality of the families, in Asian families, where you do grow up with, especially if we talk about the fathers in that generation, where they're not necessarily involved in your day-to-day. They're just there as providers and financial support, and you're supposed to obey them, listen. And, there isn't this like friendship necessarily that you build that younger generations, I think, have really embodied and embraced. But I find there to be sometimes this irony in the fact that there's this richness that comes from this Eastern practices, but yet the actual people who are living it day in, day out are not practicing that. And so then that's where some of the things that you're talking about that I've experienced, that you've experienced about being in an immigrant household where there's a lot of like strictness, the words that are used. I mean, I'll go into like one of the things that your dad said to you when he came home late at night, but there seems to be a disconnect there.
Yeah. I like how you're putting that together. I think that's worth it's a very important conversation to have. Payal, when it comes to my parents, they lived in they're older than I would imagine your parents. They're from the silent generation. And to me, that formed everything for them. The being in the war, being part of the partition, my dad, and not having a place necessarily to call home or leaving what he called home to be able to find home. This level of feeling unsafe or feeling that, and my mom too, she escaped something that was, a binding, literally having her feet bound. Her mother escaped having her feet bound because her grandmother's feet were bound in China. And so they emigrated, they moved, they literally escaped something that they were afraid of. And so what comes with that is an underlying fear that they had never processed, they had never really understood, they were very young, and that they carried with them and didn't have the resources that we do to be able to understand it, to unpack it, to even take a look at it. They don't know they experienced trauma. And so, they broke patterns in their own way, that their parents had set on them. And they repeated so much of what they'd seen and observed and learned. And it was something that my dad, we just were from totally different worlds. And as I was writing this book, I've always had such an affinity for my dad. He's been, I'm a bit of a daddy's girl. And now that I see him, he's 91 and he's aged, and I'm seeing this fear come back out of him. Before, I think it came out in very subtle ways, which I describe in the book, just like anger and frustration. And I do believe frustration of not understanding his daughter or not understanding the culture or not being able to protect or yes, they provided. And I think for him, it was more, I'm failing. If she's failing, I'm failing. And he took that very personally. And he considered as a failure because, for him, he made it, he made it out of India. He went to England. He really he had grit, which I call in the book Immigrant. And I was like, this is a grit that immigrants have, that they just put one foot in front of the other no matter what. So there's no room for, necessarily, there's no room for the soft place to land in terms of their kids, And so when it comes to yoga and Ayurveda, it's still in them because it was from the old world. Like for him, he grew up that way. His mother, gave him all kinds of food and concoction. Like they knew it's in their bones. Like, if there's blood issues, they know, okay, this is what we're going to eat. Or if there's, lung issues. And my dad had tuberculosis for 2 years. And, so for him, it was like, how do you actually get well? And so he knew it. It's just that I do feel that the fear becomes greater than the wisdom and the knowing. And I think that is for all of us, that fear is such a powerful weapon that when we act or speak or respond or react out of fear versus like really sitting with the wisdom, which I believe is the Ayurveda, the yoga, like what's really in us as Asians, as South Asians, to me, it's like it overpowers and it takes over. And I do believe that whether my parents want to admit it or not, that fear was amplified, especially when we were born. Yes, we got to North America and then our kids are born. And now we have no idea what they're talking about, what they're saying, what our kids are, we can't even relate to our own kids. And that brings up another kind of fear,
Yeah. You're bringing up something so interesting because I think this is something that there's layers to being an immigrant, right? There's layers of someone who was born and raised in the same country of origin, generations, has always had some form of that cultural stability for who they are, and then moved to another location and started from like a young age of like in their 20s, right? Versus somebody who had to flee from partition, had to then rebuild, then for sake of opportunities, as what a lot of immigrants do, leave again, start somewhere else. And then for more opportunities and better life, because now, and I believe that every parent is always thinking about how do I better the life of my children? Exactly. And immigrants definitely let you know that every day of your life that they are here because they wanted to better your life. So I love that you mentioned the immigrant.
Yes. It's real.
But everything you're kind of mentioning is like, it is very that nuance of the fact that they escape, or they leave a partition, they're finding safety. Then they move again, they're finding safety and stability. And then they're trying to find stability as like they're the parents, yet they are in the dark when it comes to their kids who are growing up in a completely foreign culture from them. And they're trying to navigate this. I mean, I know this for my own parents. My mom says this all the time. Like when I was in high school, for example, my brother was allowed to go to all the high school dances. He was allowed to like hang out with girls. He was allowed to do whatever, but I was not. I could not go to any high school dances. I wasn't allowed, like if a boy called the house, it had to be for homework and that was it. There was no just having conversations. There's a protectionist of it. And now she's seeing my nieces, my brother's kids, who one just started high school and they're letting her go to dances and they're, and so that thing came up again, that story part of how I was never allowed to go and what that was. And, my mom, she'll say, she goes, we didn't know. This was never a part of our story growing up in India. Like we didn't know what happens at these things. Like why, could we send a girl? Like they're role modeling what they know as parents because of what their parents did.
Right.
And what I keep feeling about immigrant parents or just immigrants in general is that notion of they're continuously trying to find stability, but yet because their body knows only to run from because that is what has been their situation, then that is what they keep recreating. It's like you're moving, all in search of this stability, but you're trying to find home, but that home is actually, if you were to just sit still and pause.
Which is the yoga, right?
Right.
Yeah. And I do believe it all comes from this idea of love. It all comes from love, right? This is their way of loving. It's protecting. They don't know something. So there's the fear. They don't know what goes on at a dance. They don't know what goes on. And I wasn't allowed to go on sleepovers. Like all of like you have a bed. Why would you want to sleep in anyone else's bed? And so, yeah. And, and I think there's something to that where I've really reconciled with my parents with this I've really gotten to a place where I have been able to see it from their perspective now. And that the fear, like I said, overrides anything else. And it's like, I'm going to protect you. These words that my mom, the criticism, the judgment, the don't do that, be small, be quiet, suppress. In my view, because, in North American culture, and it's like, no, be in our bigness. This is where we have power. When I feel like suppressed, what I view as perspective, here's the reframing of the perspective, that judgment played out in my head, I talk about it in the book, as like Winona, like I'm win at all costs and bulldoze and be the most, stubborn. I'm going to get it. I'm going to win at all costs. And to me, that voice was my mother's voice trying to protect me. Don't do this, do that. Don't do that. Don't do this. And so for me, that Winona was like the rebel, but in a way protecting the little girl in me. And I had to really speak to her and sit down with Winona the words in my head. And by doing that work, I'm reconciling the relationship with my mother. It will never be that I will have this conversation with my mom and she would be like, I'm so sorry, or like, never or anything. Even I would apologize to her. Like there's no necessarily a conversation that we're going to have. For me, the actual reconciliation comes from maturing enough to be able to have this conversation with my own judgments, with my own, where did I hold myself back? Because when you just touched on it with the immigrant, it's like we can decide if we're going to be guilty, right? We can decide if we're going to feel guilt. We can decide whether we take that on. And so the level of guilt any one of us feels is our choice. And for me, I chose to carry a lot of that guilt. And it was like, oh yeah, and I placed it upon myself. And that burden was a heavy backpack that I needed to really unpack, drop first of all, and then unpack. And as I care for my mom now, my aging mom, and, I see so much of this trauma come out of her. She's experiencing dementia. And so for her, it's like, how does she's just hoping to reconcile in her own way before she leaves this planet in this lifetime. And for me, I want to help her do that because that's how I can really, like, there's no other way. There's no forgiving. There's nothing to forgive. She did the best she could with what she had. They all did. Everyone is doing really the best they could with what they have. It's just like we all have something different. And so how do we now, so my generation, your generation, and the next generation, how do we really, now we can have the conversations. Now we can be able to let's heal what's within ourselves so that we can heal the next generation and actually be able to, no pointing fingers, no blaming, no ostracizing, no, cutting anybody off. It's not about that. And it's so interesting because I'll just touch on this is that a couple of some of my family members have read my book and I'll notice the difference between generations. So the older generation, the silent generation, they read it. They don't quite understand why I'm writing this, is it and so their protection mechanism kicks in and they're like, why is she, airing our dirty laundry or what? They see it as that. And that is not the intention. The intention is not to blame, to shame, to anything. It's for just this was my experience and this is how how I reconciled it. And this is how I'm healing. And now I get to heal, and have these conversations with my niece who's 17 and entering womanhood. And, she's reading my book and she's like, wow, she's making notes, and to me, that was my why.
I love that. You touch on so many things there and I think about that immigrant. And I think that this is something that gets woven into so much about the pride of your family. There's obviously this blend of, we did this for you, right? There's a lot of that happens in immigrant families. We did this for you. Oh, so now we're the bad guys. Oh, so now we didn't do enough. Right? There's a lot of that feeling of shame, of victimizing that does happen. And as you are shedding and lightening the load in that bag, I've always been, it's like, how do you navigate that? How do you navigate the part of acknowledging, as you're mentioning, it's like now you can see that that was so embodied in fear. It's like their form of protection. It's their form of love, but they're not going to get it and they're not going to understand it. And guilt that gets put onto the kids of immigrants and, you know, and we call ourselves immigrants too, but the kids who are growing up in this new culture and trying to have to navigate all of this stuff, I just really think about that as how do you hold space or how do you start to learn to hold space for compassion for your parents and empathy for them, that I understand why you are the way you are. And so I can have more kindness towards that. And now those words are not going to hit me as hard as they used to. But at the same time, there is that sense of like, I'm proud that you did this for me. Like, thank you for doing this for me. And that's something that like I've done in my family. Like I'll notice sometimes my dad will say things like, you know, if I'm doing something just a little extraordinary, right? Like building this podcast, growing this business, doing all these things. And he's like, wow, you know, I remember when I was 10 years old and we didn't have this kind of money and we couldn't do these things and whatever. And in the past, I would take it on as if like I'm trying to, like as if you're trying to guilt me for the choices I'm making. But now I actually reframe it back to him and I said, yeah, and thank you for that. Thank you for doing what you did so that I can have a better life, so that so our nieces can have a better life, like your granddaughters can. But that is my way of role modeling and working within, instead of then trying to have that, let's sit down and have this conversation, because that might work in an American family. That's not going to work with Asian parents. So it's like, it's that working within, right? That is, how do you reframe it? And I reframe it by just acknowledging, by saying, thank you that you did do those things. And so aren't you so proud that I'm taking it one step further? And so it's helping them reframe it from this nervousness of, oh, she's doing something so beyond and out of our control. And I'm not going to know how to protect her from this because I don't know how to do these things. And it's like, what are you doing here? And instead inviting them into looking at this as just the next layer.
Yeah, it's beautiful. And what was his response?
I mean, the first few times is a little off. Like he was just like, he didn't know what to do with it. Like it was just like, okay. Because I think he was just really wanting to feed into the fact that like I grew up this way and you're doing this thing and it's just like foreign. But I think after a couple times, he started to kind of like acknowledge that as like, wow, like, yeah, that is actually really cool. So
beautiful. Yeah.
And it takes time.
Yes. And that's the work, is that we can take it as immigrant or we don't have to. We can choose not to carry that as immigrant, you know?
But how do you get someone who's so ingrained in that immigrant, right? As kids who just, and help them think about it from the place of, by releasing the immigrant does not mean that you love your parents any differently. Because I think that a lot of immigrant or a lot of kids, I see this with my friends too, like they put their parents on such a godlike pedestal that they don't know how to separate from seeing the fact that their parents are human, that they've made errors, and those errors are affecting you in your life choices. But that doesn't mean that you have to love them any less.
Exactly. And this is my book, you know? It's like all of these experiences that happened to me. These were definitely things that happened to me. And then how I took that guilt and how I took it and I projected it onto other people, you know, my relationship with my dad and how I felt unseen or misunderstood. And I was like reaching for it outside of myself. You know, these are all very common conditioning. You know, it's all of us. It don't even have to be an immigrant daughter to experience this. It's happening all the time to all of us. And how can I give myself enough grace because I had to forgive even in my 40s, the 40-year-old woman who, well, I'll take a step back, is like, you know, in my 20s and like replicating that same marriage dynamic in my own marriage in my 30s, and then realizing, this is not right. This is not going to fly in this day and age, in this environment, in this culture. And for me that was the wake up call. My divorce was a wake up call. There, it is very, again, what is divorce in a South Asian family or Asian family at all? It's like, how much shame and, how taboo it is. Failure. Yeah.
Yeah. Failure on the family, right? Like, how could this happen? And you still need to work it out, right?
And still need to work it. Like, what about, can you get back together? It's like, and for me, it was, look, this was a shock. I had to really learn to speak the language of my dad. I was like, okay, our karma together was over. And now it's a new, and we were amicable. And it was like, look, this is just, we didn't want to hold each other back. And I had to really, really stand in that and be proud of the fact that I made a decision that went against every cultural fiber of my being. And it was the right decision for me because it did not align. I was not living the aligned life, powerful life, and empowered life that I knew I could be living. And so for me to make that decision I'm proud of that decision. And I really had to, no matter what was being said to me, no matter what was being said that I never heard being said, behind my back and all of that, it was just like, it was okay. I shut that out and I was like, I kept standing in my own power of like, yes, this was the right decision for me. It may not be the right decision for you. It may have brought shame and it's like, but it's my life. And not too many people can do that. So I understand. It's like the Imma guilt, because I lived so long with Imma guilt. Like that was the moment where I was like, what am I doing? This is not the right choice for me. And I actually got married out of Imma guilt, thinking, oh, well, if I can't can't live with him forever. I mean, if we're going to be together, we might as well get married. And there was all these, I never wanted to have children. So, did it make sense to get married? Like all of the things, and I didn't necessarily agree with marriage as like an institution, all the things. And so from that moment on, it was like, okay, really working with tapping into my own wisdom. Like I've had all these experiences, I describe in the book of like tapping into like planetary, experience, like the universe is, divine timing, as I was talking about earlier, or who are you meeting? And like really working with every relationship is a mirror reflection of you. And so how can I grow? And I've grown, so much in that. And I've really had to set that Imma guilt aside and be like, okay, let me really take a good look at this and create the life that I want. And that even, of course, I'll still make mistakes. Of course, I'll still doubt my choices. And have I come a long way? Yes.
Right.
And to be able to not pass that Imma guilt torch down to my niece, because I saw what was happening. I saw my niece is very much like me. We're almost like, we're two peas in a pod. And if I hadn't seen her birth, I would have thought she was mine. So, and so I saw the dynamic between her mother, like my sister and her. And that's when it struck me. It was like, oh my goodness, this is repeating itself. The relationship that I had with my mom. And it's like, I didn't feel necessarily safe owing to her with things. I didn't, feel like really held and like in exactly who I was and in my bigness. I talk about that exactly how you're saying. It's like their comfort zone was narrow and my bigness was just pushing the boundaries. Is too much for their comfort zone. Yeah. And I see that in my niece. She's big and she dims her light and she shrinks herself and she tries to fit in this box. And I'm like, I didn't want that to repeat itself because it's my duty, as her auntie, as a daughter, it was like, I could see it. So if I'm the one who could see it and I'm awakened to that, then I'm going to be the one who has to break that. And, I had really great conversations with my sister. She's we're very close. You know, she listened to me, and she was like, you know, and my niece many years ago was like, I was like, do you want her to come to you? And she's like, yeah, of course. And I'm like, well, then you got to be a safe space. And she came to me, my niece came to me, she's like, Mom's different. I'm like, yay, you know? Yeah. And so even just little conversations like that, and, you know, talking to her now with her relationships with boys and her relationship with others, and like, and how she can stand for herself in what she really wants and not really think about the influence maybe that her grandparents, you know, her parents, it's hard. It's a hard thing. You know, we all want to please our parents and make them proud, you know, and that was a reconciliation with me. It's like, I'm never going to hear that from my parents, that I'm proud. Even this book, you know, it's like, I wrote this book. It was I had to just let go of that expectation. And that's where the freedom comes. Letting go of expectations.
Hi, friends. I have a favor to ask you. If you're enjoying these episodes, then I'd really love it if you could subscribe, leave a review, or share it with your friends and family. Your words help others discover that the stories and these episodes exist in the perspectives that we're exploring over here. And the more that we can grow, the more feedback that we get from you through those reviews, the more we can make sure that we're creating meaningful episodes that you want to listen to. You have no idea how much this helps and how much I appreciate you for doing this. So if you don't mind, whether it's following us, subscribing, hitting the button below, if you can leave a review for us, or if you just share this with your friends and family, the episodes that you think that they would really resonate with, it means more to us than you can imagine. Thank you so much. That is definitely something that I think, regardless of, to your point, that we're just so conditioned to wanting to appease or get that validation from parents. It's a form of security. It's a form of stability that we have in us, and letting that go. I can't help but think about, with everything that you're talking about, just, I don't know, this is just really coming to my mind about, again, the layers of things that influence us in who we become in those moments. So, you know, they grew up in a generation, and if I think about like the 1900s, you know, sounds so like we're thinking like ancient time, but if we think about the 1900s, so much of our cultures, our world, was influenced by a British Empire that was losing its power. So if you look at it and think about it, the 1700s, 1800s, right, was like the prime of the British Empire. And then the 1900s, where they were slowly losing it, like India was gone, right? Then they had, but of course they did it with the partition. Singapore, right? All the way down to South Africa with like the apartheid, and then, you know, South Africa getting its independence. So the 1900s, what I find is like this century of an entire world that was influenced deeply by the release of colonization and having to rebirth themselves of their identity, either reclaiming a version of who they were prior to this disruption, or it's finding a new identity inside of that. And I look at, you know, the immigrants who came from that experience, where they grew up in a world also where they never really had a chance to openly express their identity because it was being dimmed by colonization. So when we talk about that dimming of self, there's still so much of that resonance of, we're coming to this country, and especially right now, right? Like in the US, there's so much fear that's being reignited around immigrants, and that this isn't your home. And that same element of identity. And I wonder how much of that is like honestly tied into the reason why immigrants have this stress and worry. Hey, keep quiet. Shh, don't say too much. You're being too loud. You're being too much. You're being this, because you don't want to be reprimanded by the colonists, right? And in this case, the colonists is this ingrained belief of that's their version of the parent who's going to discipline, the parent who's going to reprimand. And now they never got to really experience, like, what is my fully claimed identity?
I love that. And you really hit on something I feel is, to me, dimming themselves represented loyalty to something, right? That they didn't really, they're clinging on to, that they lost.
Completely. Yeah. It's a form of loyalty. It's a form of I'm not disobeying. It's like this whole group that becomes the first child, right? The first child that is always a responsible child. And it's like, here it is. And although, and they don't have the tools, or they're not equipped with how to process that. They have, the basic awareness of it, understanding, but as every generation evolves and grows and learns from the previous generation, it is a lot of that piece of, how do you kind of navigate and balance the piece of holding this cultural qualities, traditions alive that can continue to provide that love for that your parents or parents in general can say, like, okay, they haven't completely lost, it hasn't completely gone. At the same time, what I do see is that balance and assimilation, because Serena, like, if you think about yourself, like, yes, you have Asian heritage and ethnicity, but you are also Canadian. You are also grew up here. Same thing, right? Like, I may be Indian ethnicity, and I grew up in the Middle East. I grew up in Egypt and Dubai, Iraq, all of those places. And then the US, but I also have this. And so I always call myself, I'm a global mutt. Like, that's what I am. I'm a global mutt. And that's just natural cultural evolution of the world. Like, every place before the 50 years, 100 years ago was something different. It represented something different. So, like, this idea of holding on and grasping to this cultural notion of what we were versus where we are today, like, I just wonder how much of that is also a release of this guilt of holding on to a legacy of culture that doesn't fit into the world that you're progressing into.
Right. Yeah. So good. And I talk about this in the book in some ways. It's tradition I call it the culture chasm. So there's this big gap between, my parents and me, even my mom and dad. There was a culture chasm between all of us I was hoping to build this bridge. To me, it was like, I'm working to build a bridge that will span across the culture chasm so that we can eventually stand on the bridge and see around us over the chasm and say, like, okay, we were all just on the same team. Like, we weren't, opposing. And so this gap is there's silence in the gap. There's shame in the gap. There's, like, misunderstanding in that gap. There's the words that were never said. And there's disrepair in the gap. So it's like, how do we start to repair it? And also accepting the fact that I may never, because, in order to build a bridge, you need strong enough for all of us to stand on. It has to be, from one end to the other, and that other end has to be able to receive the bridge and hold it as well. And so whether that is happening between you or not, I also say, once you get to the other side of the chasm, the meaning of tradition dies. Something dies, because my parents, they come with their own traditions, and now they're in this new world. I'm born in this new world, and these are my traditions. And so trying to keep the bridge, over the chasm, someone has to let go of some kind of meaning of what tradition is. And this brings me back to what we were talking about earlier, is the loyalty. Because for me, it's like, to honor me and my traditions empirically meant I was being disloyal to my family, to my parents. It's like they saw it as me being disloyal. They're like, you not holding our tradition or acting a certain way according to our beliefs automatically makes me disloyal. And I had to really grapple with that. And at, 12, 14, 17. How do you even start to grapple with something like that? It's like, oh, I'm disloyal. I'm not being loyal to my parents. And it's like, what am I being loyal to? And that's what I really had to look at. It was like, am I creating more of a gap? Yes. And that's part of, what we have lived. Their work is to repair the gap between them. My work was to repair now the gap between them as an adult, so I'd be able to see what my part in it. Maybe I let go of the bridge. Maybe they did extend, a bridge or at least a piece of a bridge. But every time we had a misunderstanding, every time we didn't talk about something, every time there was like this silence and this overwhelming feeling of shame on either side of the gap, that bridge is in disrepair. It crumbled, to the ground. I talk about, there's this little part when I talk about my now partner and how proud I was of being with him. And my dad asked me, what is your intention with him? And as soon as I started having this really mature conversation with my dad about like, I'm committed, we're committed to one another. And if he asked you to marry him, what would you say? And I was like, yes, I would say yes. And I was so empowered by that answer. And I talk about it in the book. It's like a little glimpse of the bridge appeared between the culture chasm between my dad and I. I'm like, was I actually speaking to my traditional dad, Indian dad, about my love life? And
right. Yeah. That's not how you do.
That's not. And then poof. The bridge was gone because he started with like the word taxes or something. And then it became a practical conversation again. And so, the glimpses are there. And I do believe like the desire for my dad to feel connected to me is there. He just doesn't have the tools to build the bridge.
Yeah. Absolutely. No, I believe that. I see that. And it makes me think about, and I just consider what it means to, again, going back to that notion of like having that compassion towards them because they don't have those tools. And again, working within, like I think about in my family as well, my brother married, has the kids, has the house, has the whole thing. And here I am like rebelling and be like, I'm going to move to these different cities and countries and start a business and, chosen to be, not have kids, but, I spoil my nieces like rotten. And it's a very different path for a girl than what they imagined for me.
Sure. Yeah.
And one of the things that I did was I continued to show them how happy I am. And I continue to show them how much full my life is in the way that I live it. And over time, I remember this moment where my mom said this to me and she said, I care mostly that you're happy. And that is the most important. What you've decided to do, that's for you to decide. And I think also, living in the U.S. and now in my 40s, like obviously having quite a few family friends that have gone through divorces. It's almost gone a little bit more, it's not normalized yet, but it's still a little bit less shocking. Let's just say that, right?
Right.
That they now understand that, oh, that's right. Just because you're married doesn't mean happiness happens. And it's not the only answer. And I think that realization, because marriage was tied to the fact that a lot of women didn't work and this was their form of financial stability, of financial security. And now with women being in the workforce and a lot of them being entrepreneurs and business owners and building wealth themselves, like the idea of marriage now isn't necessarily about I need it. It's more about I desire a partner. I desire a companion that can go along this ride of life with me.
Right.
And the more that I showed them stories of this, real life examples of this, the more that they were able to actually adjust and be like, oh, okay, yeah, there is this other avenue and it is different, but now we get it. And so I just think of that as like a form of, it's like training your parents, right? It's training them to come into the world a little bit more. But it is a practice, and that practice starts with yourself. I'm just curious, though, that obviously you've done the work. I'm continuing to do the work. There's a lot of people who are, but there's still a good subset of individuals that haven't, that resist doing the work and are continuing to that cycle of the way that they show up, because there's almost an anxiety about doing the work. Because I don't think people realize, there's a lot of like online Instagram about like, do the work. And it's so like you're this awakened person, but there's a lot of darkness that comes out when you're doing the work.
Yeah.
And people are like, I don't want to, I'm good. I'm comfortable. Like I'm fine. And because they're so comfortable with the chaos, it's the familiarity is easy for them. It's the path of least resistance. Mm-hmm. So how do we do we accept that? Like that's just their journey. That's just the path. Or is there something of an open door that they can also see like, hey, you're kind of doing like that same thing to your kids that was done to you?
Okay. Well, a few things. That's a lot to unpack. First of all, let me be clear. I am still doing the work. The work never ends. The work never ends. What I do also see is that there's two things. So there's a really interesting, you have to be in relationship to be able to work on yourself. And this is where I find a lot of women are choosing not to be in relationship, not to have a partner, not to just, I'm going to do it on my own. And that's, been there. Definitely. I have done that. It has been like a really very, this independence that we have, sort of like the pendulum swing all the way to the other end versus where our mothers were, right? And I mean, wasn't that long ago. They had to, get their husband's signature for a bank account, or they couldn't vote. And that is not that far off. And so now we've swung in this other pendulum, I would say the other spectrum, the other end of the spectrum. And we're like, okay, independence. And we don't need anyone to have a child. We don't need to have anyone to have money. We don't need anyone to have a roof over our head. It's like, I can do it on my own. And what we're missing in that is this middle ground where, it's what I call interdependence. And what I had to really learn, because I was definitely that independent, the immigrant, carried me through. I was like the rebellious that empowered me. And I was modeled that too, right? My mom is very independent. But what I'm seeing is like with that independence comes so much isolation. And with isolation comes no growth. When we're isolated, we're like, everything's perfect, right? We're like, we have the perfect life.
It's so easy.
Yeah, everything's great. And in the end, it's the friction of like the being in relationship and being with someone that is, like you said, like, are we like doing this work together? Are we able to have enough friction where we get to each one of us is that mirror reflection, and the friction comes, the brightness, the lens is, the mirror of reflection is too bright, like on yourself. And you're like, oh my gosh, that I really have to look at myself now. And it's difficult. And so in order to shine the gem that we all are, and to be able to buff away the ugly parts, of ourselves and of our being, so that our true essence shines through, our brightness, our brilliance, our light. And, I had to really learn that. How do I stay? Cause I would be happy not being in a relationship. And I realized, no, I can see my mom now, and how, yes, she's married. And yes, but she has really pulled herself into a very small circle of, family, really, just that I do believe dis-ease, when you're not at ease, in yourself, and you're not at ease with, like, in relationship with others, because we have to be. And if we're isolated, it's like, we just become this sort of rigid, hold up person. And that will manifest eventually into disease. And I see that as the years go by. I see that in my mom. You know, I say it at the very beginning of the book in the introduction that she was stuck in her own sheer rigidity. And so how do we create a softness? We buff away the armor. How do we create this? This is what I was talking about at the beginning of this call. It's like this feminine energy that is big and fluid and nurturing. And we are the giving waters to the parched lands that we're all experiencing, which is the isolation. It's the isolation. It's the masculine energy. It's the overpowering. It's the dominating. It's the fixing. It's the controlling. All of this, you know, masculine sort of solar energy that we have to start to soften and quench, right? We're running out of water. So how do we resource ourselves to be that life-giving resource? And just something to what you said about you doing the work that your parents are like, what is this? You know, that to me, I believe there's a fine line, first of all, between, is it that you are trying to prove that you're happy to your parents? Or are you truly just modeling it and for yourself? And so that's, something just to be aware of. And I believe our mothers, your mother, my mother, I believe they see something in us that they wish they had done, that they didn't have the opportunity to do and the resources to do. And when they see us being in this empowered space, they're like, deep down, even though they were like, don't do it, be careful, protect. I think they know deep down they're so proud that
100%.
That we were able to move, that they gave us that opportunity,
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I think, again, there's so much of that. I see it also with myself, with my nieces, the things that my nieces are able to do that I wasn't. And I'm like, or I see the confidence that they have. And I'm like, oh my gosh, like, my younger niece is so sassy and she's got such a dynamic personality. And my older niece, like, she's also very confident, very sweet, and just knows herself really well, where she does not experience FOMO at all at the age of 14. Like, it's amazing. And I look at them and I'm like, wow, you girls are the girls that I would have wanted to be friends with when I was your age, and they're so full of life, and obviously give a lot of credit to my brother and my sister-in-law for raising them to be that way. And for raising them to be like conscious of who they are, accepting of who they are, embracing that parts of them. And it's beautiful to experience that. And I can now understand that emotional response that you have inside of yourself, to see them at the place that you once desired for yourself. And you're like, wow, look at them. Like, that's weird, but amazing. Like, it's amazing. So, it's another way I think of it, as being able to relate to how, again, every generation looks at the younger generation as, you can't help but take yourself back into those moments of who you were at that age, who you were in those experiences. But I think the important piece is not projecting it then onto them.
Exactly.
And
yes, exactly.
This place of, oh, well, you get this and I didn't get this. It's more like, wow, this is amazing, but I'm also keeping this to myself. It's my reflection. It's nothing to project onto them.
Right. It's their journey.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Serena, I want to ask you one final question.
Okay.
For those listening who feel bound by cultural expectation, generational pressure, or internalized shame, what is the first gentle step towards becoming unbound?
A gentle step, to me, doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be easy. However, I believe that forgiveness is an opportunity to open the door, to open a window, to be able to find, like I said, that bridge across the culture chasm, or even to find our own wings so that we can actually spread them and to be able to fly in whatever the direction that is our calling. And forgiveness to me isn't necessarily of other people. It can be. I think that that's very important, not easy, but it's also to ourselves, and forgiving the version of ourselves that made a decision that perhaps wasn't in our best interest. Because we've all made decisions that didn't feel good, that maybe we felt were right for us at the time. And then we look back and we're like, oh my gosh, how could I have been that stupid? How could I have been that dumb? How could I have been that, unaware? All of the things. And so that was me. For me, the first step was like, I made decisions that maybe I wasn't very proud of. And I did what I knew what to do at the time. I knew I did the best I could at the time with what I had. And we touched on this throughout the whole call. It's like, for me, it was, I accept my mom for who she is, not for who I wish she had been for me. And that was the first step. Yeah.
That right there, I feel like needs to be said again. I forgive my mom.
No, I accept my mom.
I accept my mom
for who she is, not for who I wish she had been for me.
I love that. And I think that is such a real first step to accepting, again, and I always say this, that we're all human, including our parents, and recognizing that they're going through this journey for the first time in this life as well. Finding that space.
And then you can apply it to yourself. I accept myself for who she is, not for who I wish I had been for myself. Because I didn't show up the way I necessarily wanted to show up either. And so once we start accepting all the parts of us, all the Winonas and the little girls and all the teenager, all part and the messiness. And this is where, you said at the top of the call, the vulnerability, to be that vulnerable and be vulnerable enough to be able to really accept all of us. That's true freedom. That's when all of us, all parts of ourselves has been accepted, then we're whole and we can walk in this world. I called it Unbound because, like I said, my mom's grandmother's feet were bound and then her mother escaped that. And then she escaped it and I escaped it. But what was passed down was a fear that we walked with these unbound feet. How do we, as women, as girls, walk with our unbound feet? And not that we walk on eggshells, we walk in an empowered, we stand for ourselves, and we keep taking one step in front of the other, and in a beautifully empowered way. It's not about forcing anything or, it's really reclaiming our worth, and then finding these steps and our feet and stand for ourselves and each other. Stand for each other. There's so much power in the collective feminine.
Absolutely.
That we go on that.
Thank you so much for coming, for sharing this. I mean, this is just, honestly, it's such a beautifully written book. There's so much compassion in the book as well. And the vulnerability, the honesty, I think this is something, regardless if you're an immigrant or not, you can really relate to, just from families, from relationships, connections. So I really appreciate this. How can people connect with you, find you, get this book? I will have all the links in the description, but love for you to share.
Great. Thank you. Yeah. So serenaaurora.com is the easiest way. RORA. Sometimes people put a U and there's no U. The book is available on Amazon, and there's lots of offerings, Unbound offerings, retreats, book signings, a lot of different things where people can really start the process. There's a book club. Where can we have these conversations? Keep this conversation going, because it doesn't end here. This is just the beginning of an unbinding process. It took me 50 years, and it's still happening. So thanks for continuing the conversation. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for being here.
Yeah. Thank you.